Ethan Gray had always believed in structure. He built his life the same way he built houses, brick by brick, with patience, discipline, and unwavering commitment. At 47, his days were predictable, filled with early mornings, long hours at the construction site, and evenings spent trying to keep his family together despite the quiet tensions that had crept into his marriage. This morning was no different. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the overcooked coffee in his mug, grimacing as he took a reluctant sip. The bitterness was familiar, almost comforting. One of those small inconveniences that reminded him life was still under control. Then his phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the stillness, sending a ripple of unease through him. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. Strange. He didn't usually get calls this early, and something about it made his gut tighten. "Mr. Gray?" a calm, professional voice said as he answered. "This is Memorial Hospital. Your daughter Lily has been admitted to the emergency room." The words didn't make sense at first. They felt distant, like an echo of someone else's conversation. Lily, his baby girl, in the hospital. "What happened?" he asked, his grip tightening around the phone. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "We can't discuss details over the phone," the nurse continued, "but you should come immediately." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. He grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, his coffee forgotten, his heart slamming against his ribs. Whatever had happened, it wasn't good. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights, honking horns, and worst-case scenarios flashing through his mind. Was she in an accident? Was she hurt? Was she? No. He forced himself to stop thinking like that. When he arrived, the antiseptic scent and the fluorescent hum of the emergency room hit him like a slap. A nurse guided him past curtained-off beds until he saw her, Lily, small and pale against the white hospital sheets, her wrist wrapped in a splint. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "Dad," she whispered as he sat beside her, relief flickering in her tired gaze. Ethan brushed her hair back gently, his fingers shaking. "I'm here, sweetheart." "What happened?" She swallowed hard, glancing around as if making sure they were alone. And then she told him. She had come home early from a friend's house, expecting an empty house, only to hear voices coming from upstairs. First she thought it was him, maybe back from work early. But when she climbed the stairs and peered into the master bedroom, she saw something that shattered her world in an instant. Margaret, her mother, his wife, was in their bed. But she wasn't alone. Victor. Ethan felt the name like a slap. His brother-in-law. His wife's brother. The man he had shared holiday dinners with, helped out when his business hit rough patches, trusted his family. Lily's voice shook as she continued. When she gasped, unable to process what she was seeing, two men, strangers, appeared from the hallway. Before she could react, one of them grabbed her, shoving her toward the staircase. She stumbled, trying to fight back, but another rough shove sent her tumbling. Pain exploded in her wrist as she hit the ground. Ethan could barely breathe. His hand clenched around hers, steadying her even as his mind reeled. He wanted to storm out of the hospital, march straight to that house, and no, stay in control, stay smart. Lily needed him to be calm. "Did they say anything to you? Those men?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain level. She shook her head. "Just that I shouldn't have come home early. Who the hell were they? And why were they there?" Ethan didn't realize he was gripping the bed rail until his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to relax, for Lily's sake. "You're safe now," he promised. But inside, rage curled in his chest like a snake, ready to strike. Margaret hadn't just betrayed him. She had done it with her own brother. And there were other people involved, strangers who thought they could shove his daughter around like she was nothing. This wasn't just an affair. It was something worse. Ethan pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead, his jaw tightening as he made a silent vow. He would find out the truth. He would protect his daughter. And Margaret? She had no idea what was coming. Because the next time he walked into that house, it wouldn't be as her husband. It would be as the man who would tear her lies apart. The house didn't feel like home anymore. Ethan stood in the driveway for a long moment, staring at the front door as if seeing it for the first time. This wasn't just wood and nails, not just the place where he'd raised his daughter and spent over 2 decades building a life. It was now the scene of a crime, not one that would make the evening news, but one that had shattered everything he thought he knew about his family. And now he had to step inside and face it. The air inside was different, not just quiet, wrong, stale, tainted. His boots scuffed against the hardwood as he walked in, immediately noticing what he hadn't seen before. A wine bottle, half empty, sat on the kitchen counter, next to a second glass with lipstick smudged on the rim. A jacket was draped carelessly over the back of a chair. Victor's. Scattered papers littered the coffee table, a muddy footprint smearing the rug near the stairs. It wasn't just betrayal. It was carelessness, arrogance. Then he heard it. Laughter, soft,
Familiar.
sickening, came from the living room. He took a slow step forward, his pulse hammering, every muscle in his body taut with restraint. And then he saw them, Margaret and Victor, sitting close on the couch, drinks in hand, like nothing had happened. Like his wife hadn't just destroyed their family. Like his daughter wasn't lying in a hospital bed because of their actions. Like he didn't exist. Margaret noticed him first. She straightened, setting her glass down a little too quickly, her face shifting into an expression of rehearsed surprise. "Ethan," she breathed. "I wasn't expecting you home so soon." She was lying. He could hear it in her voice. She already knew why he was here. Victor, on the other hand, had the audacity to smirk. "Hey, Ethan," he said casually, as if this was just another Friday night, as if he hadn't been caught in his own sister's bed. "Didn't hear you come in. He's testing me." Ethan didn't move. He didn't react. He just stared at them, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his presence settle over them like a storm cloud. Let them squirm. Let them wonder what he was thinking. Margaret was the first to break. "Look, I know what this looks like, but stop." His voice was low, steady. He wasn't going to let her twist this into something smaller than it was. "You and Victor need to leave. Now." Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. Good. Let her feel a fraction of the shock he'd felt. "Ethan, come on," Victor said, standing, his hands out in that same disarming gesture he always used to smooth things over. "Let's not do this. We're all adults here." Ethan's jaw tightened. Adults? Adults don't betray their family like this. Adults don't let strange men shove their niece down a staircase. Adults don't destroy lives for fun. "You think I'm going to have a conversation with you?" Ethan said, voice still dangerously low. "You think I'm going to sit here and pretend there's anything left to discuss?" Margaret stepped forward. "Please, Ethan." Lily saw everything. Her breath caught. For the first time, the act cracked. Her eyes widened, a flicker of guilt flashing across her face. Ethan took a step closer. "She came home early. She saw you. She saw what you and Victor were doing. She saw the men who were there, too. The ones who shoved her." Margaret's hands trembled at her sides. Victor's smirk disappeared. "Get out." Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't argue. Maybe he thought leaving now would make things blow over. Maybe he didn't realize how far past that they already were. He grabbed his jacket, muttering something under his breath as he walked out. Margaret didn't move. She lingered in the doorway, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Ethan, I didn't want this to happen like this." He let out a humorless laugh. "How exactly did you want it to happen, Margaret?" She swallowed hard but said nothing. "Go." For a second, he thought she might refuse. But then, she lowered her gaze and followed Victor outside. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in 25 years, Ethan was alone in his own house. The silence felt suffocating. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just a betrayal. There were other people involved. Strangers. Men who had no business being in his house, let alone putting their hands on his daughter. Ethan sat down in the dimly lit living room, staring at the scattered papers on the table. His mind was already working, piecing things together. Margaret and Victor weren't just sneaking around. There was something bigger going on. And if there was one thing Ethan knew how to do, it was dig until he found the truth. The night after Margaret and Victor left, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the dim light of the living room, his mind racing. The betrayal alone had been enough to shatter everything he thought he knew about his life. But now, the pieces weren't just pointing to an affair. They were pointing to something deeper, something darker. Those men, strangers, hired muscle. If Victor had nothing to hide, why had he needed protection? Ethan wasn't just going to sit back and wonder. He was going to find out. The next morning, he made a call to the one person he trusted with something like this. Ryan Cooper picked up on the second ring. "Gray," came the familiar, gruff voice. "Been a while." "Not long enough," Ethan muttered. "I need a favor." Ryan had been his closest friend in the military. The kind of guy who didn't ask unnecessary questions and always got answers. After retiring, he built a career in private security, specializing in corporate investigations, the type of work that made powerful people nervous. If Victor had skeletons in his closet, Ryan would find them. Ethan explained everything. Lily's accident, the confrontation, the men in his house. Ryan was silent for a moment. Then he exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I know Victor's name." Ethan froze. "What do you mean, you know his name?" Ryan didn't bother softening the blow. "Because I've run into it before. Your brother-in-law is dirty, Ethan. Real dirty." Ethan clenched his jaw, bracing himself. Ryan continued. "Shell companies. Fraud. A trail of offshore accounts that don't add up. A few years ago, I dug into a guy Victor was working with, some real estate investor who ended up under investigation for laundering money. Guess whose name kept showing up in the paperwork?" "Victor," Ethan said coldly. "Bingo," Ryan confirmed. "But that's not the worst of it. I ran a quick check before calling you back. Margaret's name is on some of the accounts." Ethan's stomach dropped. "No," he said. But even as the word left his mouth, he knew it wasn't true. It all made sense now. The secret meetings, the missing money, Margaret's sudden coldness over the past year. She hadn't just betrayed him personally. She'd betrayed him financially. She had been moving their money, his money, into Victor's hands. It was never just an affair. She was in on it. Ryan sighed. "Ethan, I need to be blunt. This isn't just infidelity. This is crime. And if you don't get ahead of it, it could drag you and Lily down with it." Ethan ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to think. "I need more than suspicions. I need proof." "I'll get it," Ryan said. "But you're not the only one looking into him." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan hesitated. "There's a detective I know, Claire Evans. She's been keeping tabs on Victor for years. You should talk to her." Ethan barely hesitated. "Get me a meeting." That evening, Ethan met Claire Evans in a quiet corner of a diner on the edge of town. She had the same no-nonsense demeanor she'd had years ago when their paths had last crossed. Back when Ethan had testified as a witness in a case she worked on. "Gray," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Long time." "Not long enough," he muttered for the second time that day. Claire smirked. "Ryan filled me in. I'll save you the trouble of asking. Victor is bad news. He's been on our radar for years." Ethan crossed his arms. "For what?" "Take your pick," she said, tapping her fingers against the table. "Real estate fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. But he's slippery. Every time we get close, he shifts assets, changes names, buys off the right people. It's like trying to nail smoke to a wall." Ethan's anger burned hotter. "And the men in my house?" Claire's smirk disappeared. "That's what concerns me. Victor's not just moving money. He's hiring protection. And guys like that don't come cheap. Which means whatever he's involved in isn't just fraud anymore. It's dangerous." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. Margaret knew. Claire sighed, watching him carefully. "Yeah, probably." Ethan exhaled slowly. "If I can get you proof, ***, real proof. ***, can you take him down?" Claire leaned forward. Ethan, listen to me. If you start digging, you become a problem for Victor. And people who become problems for guys like him don't tend to have long, happy lives. Ethan met her gaze without blinking. I don't care. Claire studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, Gray. Let's take him down. Ethan had always believed in hard work, discipline, and loyalty. But now he was learning something new: how to weaponize patience. He spent the next week laying the groundwork, one careful step at a time. This wasn't just about exposing Victor. It was about ensuring that when he fell, he didn't get back up. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. Ryan had delivered more than enough dirt to put Victor away for a long time. Fraud, money laundering, offshore accounts, the paper trail was endless. But Ethan knew the legal system wasn't fast. If they went through traditional channels, Victor would slip away again, just like he always had. So Ethan did what Victor never saw coming. He went to the people Victor had burned. Ryan had compiled a list: investors, ex-business partners, former employees who had been cheated, fired, or thrown under the bus. These weren't just people who disliked Victor. These were people who wanted him ruined. One by one, Ethan reached out. Some refused to talk at first, scared or convinced it wasn't worth it. But then he started sending them the documents Ryan had dug up: bank transfers, shell company records, hidden assets. That changed things. Victor hadn't just scammed the rich. He had ruined lives. People had lost everything because of him. And now that they had proof, they wanted to make sure he paid for it. Ethan wasn't just building a case. He was building an army. During a late-night call, Ryan's voice was more serious than usual. We've got another problem, he said. Ethan frowned, already bracing himself. What now? Victor's in serious debt. Ethan stiffened. How serious? The kind that makes people disappear. Ryan had been digging deeper, and what he found made everything even more dangerous. Victor had borrowed money, a lot of it, and not just from banks, from people who didn't like being owed. If this goes public, Ryan continued, he's not just going to be in trouble with the cops. He's going to be in trouble with everyone. That was exactly what Ethan needed. Margaret had been calling him. Over and over. He never answered. At first, it was voicemails filled with excuses. Then it was apologies. Then it was anger. She knew something was wrong, but she had no idea what was coming. Ethan listened to every single voicemail but never called her back. He wasn't interested in her lies. He was only interested in the truth. And the truth was, she had chosen Victor. She had stolen from their family. She had let their daughter get hurt. And now, Ethan was going to make sure she watched everything she had built burn to the ground. The morning was deceptively quiet. Ethan stood outside Victor's office building, hands in his pockets, watching the scene unfold. It had taken weeks of planning, digging, and patience. Now all that effort was about to pay off. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. And Victor had no idea what was waiting for him. At exactly 9 a.m., the first wave of Victor's past victims arrived. There were about 24 of them, former business partners, scammed investors, ex-employees who had been cheated, blacklisted, or robbed. At 9:15 a.m., the local news vans rolled up, cameras ready. At 9:30 a.m., federal agents arrived. And at 9:45 a.m., Victor stepped out of his car and walked straight into the storm. For a moment, he didn't realize what was happening. His usual arrogant smirk was in place as he adjusted his cufflinks, glancing at the crowd as if they were beneath him. Then someone yelled, "Hey, Victor, where's my money?" Another voice followed, "How does it feel to steal from hard-working people?" And then the questions poured in, angry, relentless. Victor froze. His smirk faded. The cameras turned toward him, microphones thrust in his face. For the first time in his entire life, Victor was speechless. Ethan watched from a safe distance, leaning against a lamppost. He wanted Victor to see him, to know exactly who had orchestrated this. It didn't take long. Victor's panicked gaze swept the crowd, and then locked onto Ethan. His expression twisted, part rage, part realization. Ethan just gave him a small, satisfied nod. Then the federal agents stepped forward. "Victor Calloway, one of them said, flipping open a badge. We have a warrant to search your offices and properties. You're going to want to come with us. The color drained from Victor's face. Margaret, standing beside him, grabbed his arm. Victor, what's going on? Victor wasn't smirking now. He turned to the agent. This is ridiculous. I have nothing to hide. Oh, the agent held up a folder. Because we have evidence of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Your accounts are under investigation, Mr. Calloway. Margaret staggered back. No, this isn't happening. Ethan saw the exact moment reality hit her. The way her face fell, her hands trembling. She hadn't believed him, hadn't wanted to believe him. But now, standing in front of the entire city, watching Victor fall apart, she finally understood. She had backed the wrong man. Victor tried to fight it. He yelled, denied, cursed. He even tried to shove past the cameras. But there was nowhere to go. No more deals to make. No more lies to spin. And as the feds led him away, Ethan finally felt something close to satisfaction. Because Victor hadn't just lost his company. He had lost everything. Margaret's call came late at night. Ethan almost didn't answer. He had nothing left to say to her. Not after everything. But something about the silence on the other end of the phone made him pause. She wasn't calling to argue. She wasn't calling to justify herself. She was calling because she had nowhere left to go. Please, she whispered. Just hear me out. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, against his better judgment, he exhaled and muttered, tomorrow. One conversation. That's it. Margaret let out a quiet breath of relief. Thank you. But Ethan didn't respond. He just hung up. Whatever she had to say, it wouldn't change anything. The next day, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Neutral ground. No memories of their past together. No reminders of the home they had shared. Just two people sitting across from each other with too much damage between them. Margaret looked different. The well-kept polish she once wore so effortlessly was cracking. Her clothes were still nice, but they didn't sit right on her. Like they belonged to someone else. Her makeup was subtle, but it couldn't mask the exhaustion in her face. She had spent weeks watching her world collapse. Now she was finally here to face what was left. Ethan sat across from her, arms crossed, waiting. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. She stirred her coffee absently, taking a slow breath. I didn't think it would end up like this. Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. No? Then how exactly did you think it would end? Margaret's fingers tightened around the cup. Victor promised me security. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. I know how it looks, but I never meant for things to go this far. Ethan's jaw clenched. You didn't mean for it to go this far? He leaned forward, voice low, controlled, dangerous. You moved money. You hid assets. You watched while your brother dragged our daughter into something dangerous. But you didn't mean for it to go this far? Margaret blinked rapidly, like she was trying to hold back tears. I was scared, Ethan. The money. Our life. I thought if I didn't help him, we'd lose everything. Ethan sat back, disgust curling in his gut. And instead, you lost everything anyway. She flinched but didn't argue. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the cafe filled the space between them. But the weight of everything left unsaid pressed down harder than words ever could. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. I know I can't undo what's happened, but do you really want to throw away everything we built? Ethan shook his head slowly. We didn't build anything. I did. And you tore it down. Margaret's breath hitched. Ethan, please. He pulled a folder from his jacket and slid it across the table. Margaret hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her face crumpled. Divorce papers. She let out a shaky breath. You already decided. I decided the moment you chose Victor over your family. Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan felt nothing.
No sympathy. No regret.
Just a hollow sense of finality. Margaret swallowed hard. And Lily? Ethan's voice was cold. She wants nothing to do with you. She shut her eyes, pained. She's my daughter. She's the daughter you let get hurt. Margaret's breath shuddered, and for the first time, Ethan saw genuine regret in her expression. But it didn't matter. It was too late. Sign them, Ethan said, and leave us alone. Margaret wiped at her eyes. What if I don't? Ethan tilted his head. Then I'll make sure every single person in this city knows what you did. Every last detail. I don't think you'd survive that. Margaret's fingers curled into the paper. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to fight back. Like she wanted to beg, argue, find a way to twist the situation in her favor. But there was nothing left to twist. She had already lost. She lowered her gaze, nodding silently. Ethan stood. Goodbye, Margaret. And just like that, he walked away. Victor, meanwhile, had no escape. Ethan had made sure of it. With Claire and Ryan's help, every fraudulent transaction, every offshore account, every buried crime had been documented and handed over to the authorities. His company was gone. His reputation, destroyed. His money, frozen. But the worst part for Victor wasn't the legal battle. It wasn't the threat of prison. It was watching the power he had spent his entire life building collapse in real time. His business partners turned on him. His associates cut ties. He was a man drowning with no one left to pull him up. Ethan had thought that when this moment came, he'd feel victorious. That watching Victor's empire burn would be enough. But instead, all he felt was tired. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about rebuilding. And for the first time in months, Ethan could finally start. But just as he thought it was over, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. A single message. You took him down. Now you owe us. Ethan froze. Because Victor wasn't the only threat. And someone else was coming. Ethan had always believed that time healed wounds. But in the months that followed, he realized something else. Some wounds never fully heal. They just become part of you, woven into your story, shaping who you are moving forward. And now, for the first time in a long time, Ethan and Lily had a future to look toward. Not one dictated by betrayal. Not one overshadowed by Victor's corruption or Margaret's choices. A fresh start. A second chance. And neither of them planned to waste it. Lily was resilient. Ethan had always known that. But seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. She had been through so much. The accident. The betrayal. The realization that the mother she had trusted had chosen power and greed over her own family. And yet, she didn't let it break her. Instead, she let it drive her. One afternoon, she sat across from Ethan at their kitchen table, a stack of books in front of her, her brow furrowed in deep thought. I've decided, she said. I'm going into law. Ethan blinked, surprised. Law? She nodded. I want to help people. People like us. People who get caught up in corruption, in legal loopholes, in people like Victor. Ethan studied her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. That's a tough road, he said. It's not easy. Lily smiled. Neither was this. And Ethan knew at that moment that no matter what happened next, she was going to be okay. For Ethan, rebuilding meant more than just moving on. It meant turning pain into purpose. With Victor gone, there was an entire network of people who had been wronged, abandoned, and left in financial ruin. Many of them were hard-working, honest people who had put their trust in the wrong hands. So Ethan expanded his construction company. But not just as a business, as a mission. He hired those who had lost everything because of people like Victor. People who just needed a chance to start over. People like him. It wasn't easy. The financial strain was heavy. There were days when the burden of it all felt like too much. But then he'd step onto a job site, see the men and women who had been given another chance, and he knew it was worth it. And just like that, his company became something more. It became a way to rebuild. Not just homes, not just businesses, but lives. Ryan and Claire remained by his side. Ryan, ever the protector, made sure Victor's criminal associates stayed far away from Ethan and Lily. He had connections, resources, and most importantly, he had a way of making people disappear when necessary. Don't ask questions, Ryan had told Ethan one night over drinks. Just know that nobody's coming for you. Ethan had nodded, choosing to accept it. Claire, meanwhile, had ensured Victor's downfall was permanent. Between fraud charges, tax evasion, and financial crimes, Victor would be buried in legal battles for years. The system may be slow, Claire had said, but in this case it's working exactly how it should. For the first time in months, Ethan finally felt safe. No more threats, no more looking over his shoulder. Just life. And it was enough. Margaret was gone. Ethan didn't know exactly where she had gone. And he didn't care. She had signed the divorce papers without a fight, packed up what little dignity she had left, and vanished from their lives. Lily never spoke of her. Ethan never asked. She was just a shadow of the past now. And neither of them were looking back. One evening, Ethan sat on the back porch, watching the sunset with a cold drink in hand. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. Lily was inside, studying, her music playing softly from her room. The air was warm, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. Really breathe. No tension, no paranoia, no chaos, just peace. And as he sat there, taking in the simple beauty of the moment, he realized something. He had survived. He had protected his daughter. And no matter what scars the past had left behind, they were still here, still standing, still moving forward. And that was victory. Time had a way of reshaping pain, of turning wounds into wisdom. 5 years had passed since the storm that nearly destroyed Ethan's world. And yet, sitting at his office desk overlooking a thriving construction site, he could see just how much had changed, how much he had built from the rubble. What had once been a small, struggling business was now a statewide operation. His company had grown, expanding beyond simple residential projects into something much bigger. They rebuilt homes, businesses, and most importantly, lives. And through it all, he had never compromised his integrity. Ethan had seen firsthand what greed and betrayal could do to people. Victor had taught him that lesson. But instead of becoming bitter, instead of letting that darkness define him, he had built something better. Something that would outlive him. Something that mattered. A legacy. Lily had come into her own. At 26, she had just passed the bar exam and joined a firm specializing in corporate fraud and financial crimes. She had taken everything they had gone through, the lies, the manipulation, the corruption, and turned it into her life's work. Ethan couldn't have been prouder. One evening, after a long day, she came by his office, leaning against the doorframe with that determined glint in her eyes. "Guess who's handling a case against one of Victor's old associates?" she said, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips. Ethan raised an eyebrow.
No kidding.
Lily shrugged. People like him don't change. They just find new ways to cheat the system. But this time we have people watching. Ethan leaned back in his chair, pride swelling in his chest. "You're good at this. I learned from the best," she said, smiling. He chuckled. "Ryan's really rubbing off on you, huh?" Lily laughed. "I meant you, Dad." Ethan just shook his head, but deep down, he knew she meant it. She had survived the worst and had come out stronger. She wasn't a victim. She was a force. And Victor's world would never be safe from people like her again. There were still scars. Some wounds never fully faded. Margaret had disappeared from their lives, and neither of them had any interest in finding out where she had gone. Victor, on the other hand, had spent years battling court cases, fines, and legal trouble. He was broke, disgraced, and forgotten, a cautionary tale in the world of business. And Ethan? He had never looked back. The past was the past, and the future was worth so much more. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan hosted a small dinner at his home. Ryan and Claire were there, his closest allies, his family and everything but blood. A few trusted friends sat around the table, sharing drinks, laughter, and memories. Lily sat beside him, listening to Ryan tell some exaggerated story from their military days, rolling her eyes but smiling all the same. Ethan sat back, watching the scene unfold. For years, his life had been a battlefield. For years, he had fought to protect the people he loved, to rebuild what had been taken from them. But now there was peace. Now there was something unshakable. Now there was legacy. He raised his glass, clearing his throat. To the people who stood by me, he said. To the people who proved that trust isn't just a word, it's an action. And to the life we built. The glasses clinked together, a quiet but powerful moment. Because no matter what had happened before, they had won. The storm had passed, and what remained was stronger than ever.